Two of the announcements that I sent out. I do apologize if I A, gave anyone a heart attack for rigging grades, and B, for the 10 announcements that I sent out like a crazy person. So the sort of most recent announcement is just a sort of awkward key to my janky notes on those little grade PNGs. So it's mostly for the IK stuff, but if there's any confusion about what that was referring to, hopefully it's clarified here. If it's not, please do let me know. Apart from that, I did, well, this was due today, so I hope you guys just sort of saw this. I added a sort of extra thing. If your rig was really, really broken and wouldn't animate for some reason, just an extra thing, sort of evaluating what you would still need to do for the rig for that first steps assignment. And if I remember correctly, I think I said this Friday was the cutoff for decide if your rig is so unworkable that it would make more sense to use Skelebot. So that's another thing you might want to sort of consider for that. But mostly, I do want to bring attention to I did make some slight changes to the way the rig was graded, mostly to give everyone sort of extra points or minimize the sort of requirements and I guess unnecessary work. So where I previously required a switch for all of the limbs, I'm now only requiring it on 2. I do recommend you do them on the arms, because most frequently I feel like people need them on the arms as opposed to the legs. And if you happen to have already set up more than 2 FK switches, IKFK switches, you will get extra credit points for those. And I'm just going to sort of systematically go through. I'm going to wait until resubmits are in, and then just sort of grade those, and if anyone didn't resubmit their rig, I'll go through and just sort of tweak the remaining point values. I've been keeping track of who I've been grading and stuff like that. But yeah, so that's just sort of the rig. Does anybody have any questions about that or any other rig grade things? Cool. Yeah, I do realize the grading for the rig was a little bit eccentric. It was sort of designed to, if something is super, super broken and will cause you problems animating, that was something that I would usually sort of take points off as hopefully an incentive to fix it. But yeah, so it was basically just that. I think that was all the weird bureaucratic stuff today. So before we hop into super quick, goofy terrain demos, does anybody have any questions of stuff they want to go over? Yeah.
When it comes to rigging, at least for me, I'm having trouble when it comes to I don't know, are you supposed to bind the skin to the skeleton?
Yes.
So when I do that, when I try to move my arm a little bit of the chest that's not really supposed to move also moves with it.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of weird, and even I think when I get to the shoulder, I think a small part of the face kind of moves. I'm kind of confused. How will it just get rid of that?
Yeah, so I think I will come back. I was gonna do the rigging stuff sort of after, but really quick, Cynthia asked. I think what really. So I think what was happening is probably you had maybe something set up like this. Imagine this is a crappy, 2-piece robot arm.
Yeah.
Where I imagine what happened is if you did skin, bind skin, double check my settings, cool. When you bent this joint, it would take part of the upper arm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is a function of how you do your skin binding. So if you look at your tool settings, these are the settings that I used. So in this case, my guess is that you were using bind to joint hierarchy. And that's basically, if I select any joint, it's going to attach your skins to all of the joints surrounding it. So even if you grab this guy here, it would still attach these skins to this joint and this joint. The easy way around that, and to be clear, if you're doing something like a fleshy character, an animal, a human, that normally is what you want. For a robot with just individual pieces, I'm going to go ahead and unbind these skins. Actually, I will unbind one of these skins and then show you a way to sort of fix existing skins. So if you're setting it up from scratch, in this case, again, I've unbound the skin. I would just want to select this skin and then only the joint that I want that attached to, and set the bind to selected joints. After that, you can I still just sort of set these by default if I'm doing these particular settings, and then hit apply, and you'll notice that when I move the elbow, it's now not dragging the upper arm with it. But it will, it'll move if you move this joint. If you already have a bunch of skins bound and maybe you don't feel like unbinding and rebinding them.
Does that have to be done each manually if you have the entire thing binded?
Yeah, it does.
Uh,
I never said it wasn't tedious. But it is actually less tedious than what I'm about to show you if you wanted to sort of fix the weights. You could also go and just like select all the vertices on your piece and do one of two things. You could paint skin weights tool for this and say I only want this on joint 2. This is probably the least recommended and most tedious way possible to do this. You could also, again, sort of grab all your vertices, go into Windows, General Editors, and Component Editor. I would love if they opened up on the same monitor I was working at. And then go under Smooth Skin, the Smooth Skins tab, and just, I know I want it attached to joint 2. I'm just going to go ahead and enter a value of 1, and then it should only follow this lower joint. So if I move this elbow now, you can see it's not deforming super crazy. So I would imagine it was just sort of like had too many weights on things.
yeah.
Cool. Any other questions on that? Yep. All right. Cool. So, like I said, I'll do the sort of terrain demo really quick and then skip back into rigging. But basic terrain. The most easy sort of basic goofy way to make terrain is with a texture deformer. So I'm just going to make a plane, add like 200 subdivs to this. Yes, you do need a lot of them. And go into just my modeling menu, deform menu, and texture. Excuse me. So when you apply this, nothing happens by default. You'll notice it adds this little sort of texture deformer thing in your outliner. Click on that and go into your attribute editor, and it will allow you to plug in things to this. So in this case, for a ground plane, I'm just going to use a noise texture. And you can see it pretty much just makes a goofy, lumpy ground plane. There's nothing inherently fancy about this, but it is a good way to just sort of, excuse me, to just break up your land a little bit instead of having a flat plane. You can do this, and it'll kind of, make things a little more interesting. There's also different types of noise you can use, if perhaps you weren't a fan of whatever the default one was. So you can play with that. And then if you're so inclined, you can go through sort of after you've done that, or before, and just grab some vertices with soft select turned on, and be like, look, hills. Huzzah. Like I said, this is like pretty janky terrain, but it does count as terrain. It's a little bit more interesting than it was 10 seconds ago, and you didn't have to switch programs, and it took like 10 seconds. So that's the sort of like basic thing that I do, honestly far more than I care to admit, is literally just me being a nut job and using deformers to sort of bend shapes. The other thing that's kind of interesting you can do with a texture deformer, if you're ever looking for really cheap, crappy water, like animated water, and for the record, like this is like river or stream kind of thing, and this is not like nice looking, but if you take the time on this noise slider and you slide it around, it will kind of make things jiggle a little bit. And in this case, I think this is actually a really ugly, I think Perlin noise is a little bit of a better sort of movement for that. But you can key all of these values. So if I go to frame 1 and I set a key on time, and then I go to frame 25 and I key this at like 10, you'll notice that as I scrub between these, we have this very, very strange sort of animated something. Again, to me, this one actually looks like clouds a little bit, but you can do a sort of janky animated water like this. I wouldn't advise it if you're looking for super nice water in the foreground of your scene, but if you just sort of like have a river off in the distance, you can do this and just kind of have it there. It'll reflect light a little bit more interestingly than otherwise. That's a super basic texture deformer. Does anybody have any questions about how I set that up? Cool. One thing I do want to point out, if you are doing a texture deformer, so I'm just going to throw this on a sphere really quick. Texture, there we go. Come on. And I will just hook up, again, a noise texture. You can use whatever texture you want. You can use a picture of your face or a cat, and it would put that on here, very awkwardly. But you will notice, like with this one, it doesn't behave in the way that I might want or expect, where it's like the sides almost look smooth, and it's just the top and bottom that are kind of textured. If that ever happens, it's not uncommon with non-plane objects. You just want to go into your texture deformer and set the direction onto normal. When it's set to handle, it's pretty much just like, hey, only deform this along, it defaults to like the y-axis. If you set it to normal, it'll deform away from the mesh's surface. So are you guys all familiar with face normals? Cool. But yeah, so basically you're looking for, again, normal displacement, presumably apart from handle displacement, and that'll allow you to map this onto any weird shape and have, lumpy noises. I also know, so I'm not doing like a hardcore trash demo today, but I do know a lot of people are interested in doing like piles of trash. This can be a potentially interesting way to just like, make a lump in the ground that's slightly more detailed. If you wanted to do like a base texture and then just like have a bunch of objects like sticking out of it, you can make like, ooh, here's a creepy rock or something. But yeah, here is Maya's very, very janky scenery. Any questions on that before we move into a slight ZBrush thing, which is going to look way less hideous? Cool. For ZBrush, I'm going to make another plane of no particular size, and I'm just going to start this out at 200 subdivs. I know I'm going to need it. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a file export on this. I'm being exceptionally lazy and leaving this in my basic Maya project folder. I would love to know what ass export is. Every time I see it, I'm like, I'm going to look it up one day. All right. So I'm also, before I get super into this, I am going to do like a weird basic review of ZBrush. I know I went over it in like CGI 2. I think I traumatized my entire class with ZBrush. So I'm just going to do like a basic thing on like how to import models, like where some of the basic menus are, and then I'll show you some of the sort of sculpting bits. This is ZBrush if you've never seen it before. If you need to import a model, on the right side of the screen there's this lovely import button. Click it, find the thing you want to bring in. Find a thing. Oh my god, it still is my project from last week. I thought they cleaned these. Do you guys know how often they clean these computers?
Non-existently during each term, they wait until it breaks basically and then wipe the whole thing.
Interesting, because most of the time it wipes it like every week, but only sometimes and only in certain rooms. Who knows? Either way, click on your object, and then you should be good to just drag it into your, oh good, I exported that as well. You should be good to just sort of left mouse button click and drag this into your scene, at which point you would want to click edit. If you don't click edit, whenever you click, it's just going to keep making more of these, kind of look like snitches, and it's going to do that until you click edit. Otherwise, like when you're only on draw, it's going to assume like, hey, you just want to keep putting these in your scene, right? You'll notice at this point, like what we have, it's only rotating one of these objects, and it's left all of these here. If that ever happens to you guys, just go into the Layer tab at the top, and just hit Clear. It'll get rid of all of the extra random things that you've just drawn in for no apparent reason. So this is what we're left with. Navigation in ZBrush is predominantly controlled by the right mouse button and lots of buttons on your keyboard. So rotation is pretty much click anywhere and drag with your, again, right mouse button. Panning back and forth is right mouse button and Alt. And the other one, zoom. Zoom is control and the right mouse button. Honestly, if you have never done ZBrush or it's been a hot minute since you've done ZBrush, it'll probably take you like 15 minutes to figure out how to navigate in here. Totally normal. But anywho, so basically, you'll notice like it almost immediately lets me draw on this mesh. In this case, I'm just going to really quick, very briefly go over how to get rid of these because they annoy me and I don't feel like exporting another mesh. So silly thing you could do, or not silly, I do this all the time, but option one, if you didn't want to do this, is just re-export your mesh and re-import your mesh. In this case, it's already here, so I'm just going to leave it. So on the right, once we have a model imported, you'll notice that it's given us a bunch more menu options here. If you're ever trying to scroll in this, you have to click and drag up and down. Like, you can't use a scroll wheel, and I don't understand why. But the subtool palette is basically ZBrush's weird version of the outliner. So it shows you all of the sort of objects or models in your scene, as well as some other random options. You can do booleans and other stuff here. And in this case, like each sort of block of stuff here is going to be, think of it as like one object basically in Maya. So what I'm going to do is really quick, just go ahead and go down to split and split to parts. This is effectively the same thing as a mesh separate. Hit OK. It's like you can't undo this. I'm like, I don't care. I don't want it undone. Did you do the thing? Wait. What are you doing? Split to parts. Did I hit cancel the first time? What is happening here? Oh, that's helpful. I didn't know that existed. Really? Split to similar parts? What? Okay, when that for some reason doesn't work, go back into Maya and re-export your object. I did export all, didn't I? Do it all the time. All right. Haha, I'm just going to overwrite this. I don't know. Sometimes ZBrush is a little quirky. I can use ZBrush to do pretty much anything I need to, but every once in a while it does some weird stuff. So I just went ahead and imported the new model. If you do an import with something already in your scene, it'll just overwrite that. So in this case, it's just overwritten that plane, and now I have this delightful thing here. For terrain, that's probably all you're going to need to do in the the subtool menu. What you will want to do usually is go into the geometry menu and hit divide a few times. So what that's doing, if you're looking at the poly count here, which is sort of like up in the upper rightish of your screen, you'll notice like as I divide it, oh hello, it's going and it's basically doing the same thing as like a mesh smooth in Maya. That's what that is. The nice thing about ZBrush is that at any point during your sculpting, pretty much, you can go back to your previous subdivisions. So I've turned on wireframe. Hotkey for that is Shift F. Alternately, there's this little button here that will toggle the wireframe on and off. But you'll notice like here's the base mesh we started with, 2 subdivisions. At some point, it should start sort of adding more. You probably can't really see that on the screen on the projector. But it basically just gives you a lot more resolution to work with, and you can always bump it back down to a lower resolution. So that is effectively sort of getting things into ZBrush so that you can sculpt them. By default, as soon as you hit edit, it allows you to doodle on your model with the default standard brush. And to do that, you literally do just doodle on your model. There's a few different brushes that you can use. There's also, up here you find your different sort of menus of brush settings. So draw size is going to be your brush size, pretty much the same thing as Photoshop. Z intensity is almost like opacity. It's basically like how high that stroke is going to go, or like how much that's going to indent your model. So if I set that was like 100, if I set this to 5, you really can barely see that until I go over this 80 bajillion times. So sort of play with that to do whatever you want. And then focal shift is a little bit like brush softness. So this is a focal shift of 0 here. If I set it to -94, it gives me these extremely like hard, aggressive lines. And then larger numbers are basically like super soft feathered brush. Those are, again, sort of the basic tool settings in ZBrush for all of the brushes. If you ever need to smooth something, so like in this case, I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, this looks truly appalling, and it's like really gross and jagged. There's 2 things you can do to fix that. One, in this case, I want to smooth this a little bit, so you can just press and hold Shift, and you can see like when I do that, it toggles me to my smooth brush from the standard. And then just sort of doodle over this. It'll, again, sort of like even everything out a little bit, get rid of some of the crazy lumpies in it. The other thing you can do, so in this case, that area was really low poly and jaggy looking, because you can see that for what I'm trying to sculpt, there's not quite enough geometry for that. So one of the fixes for that is to go and actually just add more subdivisions, which I already have them here. So I'm just going to sort of scrub through this like little subdivision slider so I can see them. But you'll notice now if I draw, it's by default, it's like significantly less jaggy than it was previously. So that's sort of like basic generic brush stuff in ZBrush. Is there any questions about that? Cool. Cool tidbit about ZBrush, you can pretty much undo for eternity unless you close the file. So like, I can literally, if I wanted to, go back before I imported anything, and then like, oh, here's my first model, and it's like ridiculous. Like the undo counter is nuts. You can also go in and see your edit undo counter here, and it gives you a slider. But I've had this get up to like 1,000 before, and it's very, very hard to toggle at some point. But anywho, so I'm just going to go back to before I doodle on this. And I'm going to look at, other thing I do want to note about ZBrush, so you'll notice that this is 2.5 million polys right now. ZBrush can usually handle that, unless you're working on a really old computer, but like I do pretty much everything on a laptop. And I've taken my laptop up to like 11 million polys before, and ZBrush has been fine. It does take a few minutes to like compute things sometimes, but the actual drawing on the mesh is like pretty much seamless. So don't be afraid to like put your poly count up pretty high, because usually it's not going to blow up the computer. So anywho, different brushes that I just want to show you guys that I find personally helpful. The first thing, if you click on this brush menu, it'll give you a bunch of different brushes. If you know the name of something you're looking for, you can press the letter that begins with. So in this case, I press C, and it's going to show me by default all of the brushes starting with C. You can press B at any point in time to bring up this brush menu. And again, like I could search for different brushes if I wanted to. First thing I think is kind of helpful, maybe possibly less so for land, but it is really helpful if you're ever sculpting like skin on an old person or something, is this Dram Standard. And basically what this does, it just gives you a really, really nice, deep, like sharp crevice with very, very smooth sides, which sounds really boring and dumb, but is really, like I said, really good for skin. If you make this, like imagining we are actually trying to make some kind of landscape, we could very, very easily trace in like a sort of shallow, weird river or something like that, or like area between sand dunes into a model. So it is kind of handy. I didn't know it existed for a long time. It's pretty nice. I don't know. I like it as a brush. But that's basically what it does. It's just like pointy little lines with nice soft edges. The other things that I use most frequently are the clay buildup, and clay tubes. They all do very similar things, they just behave very slightly differently. So the clay brush, it's going to have, by default, this really, really nice sort of soft edge on it. As you're drawing, tracing over the same area, until you release your mouse and click again, like I just did, it's going to keep everything at exactly the same level. So it can be kind of helpful if you're trying to like make a plateau or something like that. You can really easily get these sort of like ledges drawn in here and just sort of like, you know, weird shapes like this. Other brush, so that's clay again, and you can modify all the settings of these. I'm just showing you these because these are the ones I personally like. Clay buildup is pretty, well, that's actually the weirdest one out of all of them. Clay tubes does basically the same thing as the normal clay brush, except instead of having a nice soft edge, it has a really, really harsh edge. But you'll notice that if I trace over the same area like a bajillion times, nothing happens. Nothing happens until I release my mouse, at which point it'll sort of start adding extra layers. So this is even better if you want like super harsh areas, but a lot of times I don't use this because it has these really icky, pointy edges on them. So in this case, like this is maybe something I would want to smooth out a little bit. So with my smooth brush, it's turned all the way up to 100, and it's still being really, really slow with the smoothing. So one thing you can do is actually just slider your mesh back down to a lower poly level, and go ahead and smooth that. The fewer polys you have, the faster it is going to smooth. And then you can always go back up and just sort of be like, oop, missed a little area in this higher subdivision level, and just sort of like very, very quickly sort of make changes that way. It's counterintuitive, but it is much faster to work like that than just sort of brute force smoothing down the highest subdivision that you have. So that's clay tubes. And then clay buildup is the one that sort of behaves a little differently from both. It's basically the sort of hard clay tubes, but if you go over an area a lot, it's going to make a giant spike of terror. So this one's good for building like faster volume. It also does a really great job, if you're not paying attention to what you're doing, of like stretching the crap out of your mesh and like, what is this? So do be aware, like this is an example of bad geometry in ZBrush. Very, very bad. To fix, I usually just hit it with a smooth brush. It's not always perfect, but it will usually reduce most of the clipping. And then again, just sort of, now we have Ice Cream Mountain or something. This looks ridiculous. What is this? We're gonna go with it. It's a nose. So those are, again, sort of the three clay brushes that I usually use. I think there's two more brushes that I want to show you guys. One is H-Polish. It's just strangely helpful. Every once in a while, if you want to sort of like flatten an area, there's a few brushes that can do this, but you'll notice like if I sort of drag, it almost feels like sandpaper in a way, where it'll sort of like shave down and sort of like flatten curved areas. Sometimes I do use this if I'm trying to make like a hammered metal look. You can kind of go in and, you know, do some interesting effects with this. But it can be an effective way to sort of like smooth an area if you're otherwise having trouble with that. And I think the only other brush that I want to sort of bring your attention to, I don't know if it's super relevant for terrain, but for some reason I only learned about this recently and I'm like, my god, this is magical. And that is the Move brush. You literally can, depending on like your brush size, just drag, like if that was really curvy and insane looking, like I can just sort of use my Move tool to like force that back into maybe something a little bit straighter than it was previously, or even just sort of grab this whole thing and be like, nope, why is that so tall? So it is really powerful. It is based on the direction that you're looking at your model. So for example, like if I grab this now and I move this like this, it's going to be pretty much like straight. It's moving this on the plane that you're looking at it, sort of perpendicular to the camera, if that makes sense. So do be aware of that. Like if you're trying to move something, make sure that your camera is going to set up so that as you're dragging it left and right, it's going in the direction you want. But those are sort of the basic ZBrush tools that I generally use. And again, if I wanted to ensure that that giant peak of terror that I made wasn't clipping itself, I just went down to my lowest subdivision and just smacked that down a little bit. It's now slightly less insane. That's my super, super basic ZBrush tutorial. Does anyone have any questions about this? Okay. There's like 1.5 more things that I want to show you, and it mostly relates to actually exporting meshes from ZBrush. So one of them, other thing. There's like 2 more things I want to show you, sorry. I'm going to go back to my standard brush, and you can turn on alphas for ZBrush. So this is pretty much like different brush shapes. And I can make, like by default, I can make these weird little stars on stuff if I wanted to. You can also add, they have textures for like different noise textures, different sort of strange lumpy patterns. And you can also go ahead, they have this thing. You can also go ahead and import your own alphas if you want to. So to do that, you would just go to import. It's going to find an image file somewhere and pull it in. If you're ever looking for these, they have a lot of really, really good ones for rock textures. So if you go on textures.com, so they have like sculpting brushes for ZBrush. And you can go through and download a few of these every day, but basically like, you know, if you click on something like this, this is the alpha that you would bring into ZBrush. So you would just download this, throw it into ZBrush, and it's going to make this really delightful sort of rock texture or like chunk in your sculpt. So if you are going for like rocky terrain, super, super easy way to get a lot of really nice looking rock texture into your stuff. For this, like they also have a bunch of other stuff for like different ornaments and scrolls and other random things you can add to this, but they have screws. But yeah, so that's really handy. You can also just make your own depending on what you need. But yeah, so I mostly just sort of wanted to show you guys that those were there and also use them as a silly thing for my next demonstration. So obviously, so if you're doing a ground plane, my opinion is that it is better to block in all of the major shapes in the geometry itself rather than using displacement maps. If you have maybe mountains far off in a background you're never going to use, displacement map it, I guess. Still probably faster to render if you just have the actual poly sculpt in there. But especially for the terrain that you want your character actually walking on, how do you tell if they're on the ground if you only see the ground texture at render time? The answer is you kind of can't, or you just have to consistently test it on a render, and that's awful. So for ground, I usually do recommend exporting actual high poly meshes of your stuff. That being said, 640,000 polygons is not something you probably want to bring into Maya, especially this 2.5 million version of this mesh.
That'd be even worse than a game engine.
Oh, yeah. That would murder a game engine. Probably. So every once in a while I get a chance to look at like actual assets from like actual games.
Yeah.
And I looked at one the other day, and a character, like sort of a hero character, was I think it was about 10,000 tries for a main character in like an actual game designed to be played on, consoles of reasonable power. So I don't know if that's like helpful to anybody. If you guys ever have questions about poly count, I'm not necessarily great at optimizing the scene, but like my boyfriend works for a game company, and I can creep on games on your behalf. I just can't tell you what assets I'm talking about from which games. But yeah, so that's the thing you guys are interested in, let me know. But yeah, so I'm just going to start on this 2.5 million poly thing. To reduce the poly count in this, there is a plugin if you go in your Z plugin menu, and it is called Decimation Master. I didn't know this existed. It is the love of my life. First thing, I'll explain how this works in a minute, but basically just hit preprocess current. It's going to go through and make like a little cache or stash, or I don't know. It saves information about your file so that you can manipulate it quickly in the future, which is really handy because this is so ridiculously high poly. It's going to take a minute. But basically what this does is it's going to go ahead and strip your model down really, really aggressively to preserve as much detail as possible with the fewest number of polygons possible. So depending on, like I've taken like an 11 million poly sculpt before and reduced it down to 250,000 polygons with no appreciable loss of quality. You just lose a lot of file size, which is great. But it usually does a pretty good job. Sorry, it's taking a while. But it does a pretty good job of adding extra polys in areas of high detail and really aggressively stripping them in areas of low detail. So all of this nonsense that I added in down here is going to be much, much higher poly than like this sort of very gently rolling hill that we have here. This is what I use for all my 3D prints, or like pretty much any time I just need to export an actual model of a high poly sculpt. So again, this is like sort of not workflow for making a displacement map, mostly just workflow for like I need a terrain and I need the object. Apparently it is reordering. I don't even know what half of this stuff is doing. It's interesting. All right. So it's done. You want to go back into the Z plugin Decimation Master menu. And what it's going to allow you to do, so I'm going to go ahead and turn on my wireframe for this. Again, hotkey is just Shift F. But what I'm going to do is just leave it at the default setting. So basically, this is going to say percentage of decimation. This number is, I would like to retain 20% of the 2.5 million polys that I have. So it's getting rid of 80% of the topology on this model. So I'll go ahead and hit decimate current. And you can see that it's gone through. It's changed the topology pretty dramatically. For one, it's triangulated, which if you're not smoothing this, who cares? 3D printing, don't smooth it. I use this all the time. Game meshes, obviously that's totally fine. For animation meshes, like, it's not. For terrain, I would kind of just leave it. Like, you don't need to smooth a giant piece of terrain, in my opinion. As long as you have, if your character's like going to be, close up to the ground, you just want to make sure that this is of a resolution where it doesn't look super absurdly low poly. But you will notice, so again, if I scroll out, you can see pretty clearly like where it's gone through. It's stripped the crap out of the side of this. Pretty much like barely any geometry there. Same with up here, but like this area down here is like really, really high poly because it's like, oh, this is more curvy, this is more detailed, I should keep more geometry here. So what you can actually do, and again, the nice thing about like waiting for it to pre-process once is you can be like, okay, that was actually maybe, I want more geometry in this. And it takes like 3 or 4 seconds to go through and change all of this topology. And I can tell you that I have done this in numerous programs. ZBrush is by far the fastest by like 4 or 5 times. So in this case, I'm going to be like, what if I take this down to 4% of the geometry? And like, honestly, that still looks pretty good. If you're looking at that from farther away, there's like barely any loss of quality, and now we have 117,000 points instead of 2.5 million. And we can go into buttons. Oh my god. Guys, I've forgotten how to navigate in ZBrush. But we can go down here, and this is still, you can definitely see a little bit of faceting, but it's still like pretty dang decent, especially considering what we had before. So if you guys are ever doing this for terrain, I would recommend sort of like finding a poly level you guys are happy with, and then going through and just like pretty much exporting your mesh like you normally would. Which I should probably show you because that would make sense. If you're done with this, you're happy with the poly count, just go ahead and hit this export button here, call it ground or whatever you want to call it. And you'll notice that if we, this is actually, I was going to say maybe this is like lower poly than our actual ground, but I don't think it is. But if you import it back into Maya, it's going to leave it in the same position that you had it previously. You'll see it's just, here's the textured version. So other silly thing you can do, which is just like dumb hack, is like that little recessed area. Look, it's an instant river if you jam a ground plane into it. I did say hacky ground. But yeah, and then you could texture deformer this and be like, oh, look, we have this glorious rippling water just sort of like on this random fly through or something. But yeah, so I mean, this is honestly usually how I make terrain. The other thing you can do if you're so inclined, so like this would, with the exception of this ridiculous thing, work fairly well for a displacement map. If you are doing anything like this for a displacement map, I would recommend avoiding ginormous overhangs like, caves or something like this. Like if you sculpt this in and try to use a displacement map on it, it's going to throw a lot of issues. It's not going to know what to do with that. So this is something that you would want to like actually just model into the ground itself. But yeah, any questions on any of that? All right, 2 more tools I want to show you like super crazy fast. First one is, so we have this really sort of low poly version of this sculpt. If for some reason you're like, oops, I need to edit this, and I for some reason can't go back to my like quad subdivided version, there is a way to sort of get that back so that you can still work with it in quads, or at a minimum like, oh, I need a detail over here. There's no topology to support that. In your geometry tab, there is Dynamesh. And I will go over this more next week, but basically you can click it. This is a very aggressive version of what it does, but you can see it just sort of goes through and tries to apply basically a grid or quads to this, and it just does it in the most even way possible without destroying a lot of your detail. In this case, I think I've actually added some weird groups to this somehow by accident, so it's behaving a little oddly, but if you did ever need to go back and sort of like add more resolution into your mesh, again, you can do that with this. You just want to, if you don't want to get rid of this detail here, just set this resolution much higher. And then you can work with your mesh pretty much like you normally would, and then subdivide it or decimate it with Decimation Master again, etc. I think that's pretty much my janky ground topology tutorial for the day. Are there any questions on this or anything else with ZBrush before I move on to other rigging things? Huzzah. All right. So next week I'm going to show you some ways to use ZBrush to like make slightly less grotesque looking trees if you're using polypaint. It's a relatively fast and easy way to do that. I just wanted to show you the terrain today. I know like a lot of you guys are going to start animating and or are making terrain, and I figured I should show you guys that before you get super far into that. All right. So it seems I looked through the responses. I didn't look through what percentage of which class submitted different things. So I'm just going to sort of go through like the major things people are interested in. Do you guys want to see another bit of outliner structure and sort of like explaining how and why it's set up the way it was in the videos? Okay, I'm going to assume that that's a no. Binding skin, we kind of just did that. Anyone want to see anything else with that? Okay. IK handles and how they work. Cool. All right, so with IK handles, did you have any specific questions with that, or just sort of?
I was having some weird issues that with my legs when I bend the IK handle. direction, they would like rotate
Yeah.
in the wrong direction, which is kind of weird.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think I probably know what's causing that. So I'm gonna be a real person and like put in some fake leg geometry. It's gonna be amazing. All right. So we have fake leg number 1, fake leg number 2, and fake leg number save as. I feel like the mirror from Shrek, where I'm just like bride number 1. All right. So basic sort of ideal version of a leg setup is going to be tilted very slightly. Should have changed these pivots beforehand. But like tilted. What have I done here? That is not the ideal setup for a leg at all. Hang on. When in doubt, delete your other legs. Okay. One more time. So, ideal structure for a leg setup. Really? When in doubt, delete history on your objects, ? And freeze transformations? Okay. What? Guys, what have I done? Okay, I don't know what was happening. Every once in a while, you find this strange error where if you like delete freeze transformations on both objects at once, children object will snap back to where they were previously or something. To avoid that, freeze the transformations on the child and then freeze transformations on the parent object. I don't know why it does that, but it's very annoying, and now we can actually rotate this without the leg exploding. All right. So, ideal setup for a leg is a slight bend forward like this. So I'm assuming that the character is like here. Let me actually just make Pinocchio head. It will be much, if not more obvious, then at least more entertaining. We have here Pinocchio. He is facing forward with a floating leg. So this is the ideal leg setup. If you're doing knees and you want the knees to bend forward, you would have the joint sort of set up with a point pointing forward, and if you look at them from the sort of front of the body, there's no rotation left and right. So an example of like a sort of less than ideal leg setup would maybe be if a leg was rotated slightly like this, where it's sort of coming out and like bent to the side this way. You'll notice this one still has this pretty much the same rotation in the front. But a leg setup like this is going to cause some issues while you're trying to actually set up your rig. So I'm assuming that this is sort of what was probably causing your crazy IK flipping. I'm going to set up I'm going to set up joints on these. That would help. And then I will set up a IK handle on both. So we have janky joints number 1 and janky joints number 2. So again, ideal sort of rig structure for just easier dealing with when you're rigging is to have all of your joints like totally straight, coming down forward instead of what I have here where they're sort of like bent off to the side. If we hook up an IK handle, where are we going? Skeleton. Check my presets. If we set up an IK handle on each one of these, okay. Well, that one just, what? Maya, what are you doing to me? Are you adding extra joints? What? Okay, that was weird. So we've set up an IK handle on each one of these. I'm going to grab both and just move them up at the same time. And I guess for the sake of I took the time to make legs, I'm going to bind the legs. And again, since these are just stick legs, I'm just going to do selected joints for that binding process. What? Why do you yell at me? What? He's already... How are... Oh. Well, that's fun. Great. Guys, I made an umbrella. I feel like I could probably actually use that at some point, but apparently it's yelling at me because these skins, I guess, was... When I selected the parent, it also bound the child, so I just unbound those, and I'm rebinding them manually because Maya is ridiculous. All right, we have sort of functional legs. So this is kind of what was happening with yours, where like it bent, it's like bending crazy outwards.
I'll come over and show them. It was
Cool.
really weird. It was like instead of bending like you'd expect at all, it was at like this leg right here,
Yeah.
would
Oh,
just
would it like
kind of-
flip behind or
it would,
something
like,
crazy?
rotate like that way.
Oh.
Like it would spin just right out of the joint. It was really weird.
Oh, that's weird. Yes, so if that happens, normally my janky cure for that is just sort of like delete the IK handle and put in a new one and see if that explodes.
Yeah.
Because honestly, every time I've seen that, it's easier to. Don't know if I've ever found like an actual fix. It's just like, let's just delete the handle and set it up again.
Okay.
But yeah. Cool. But yeah, so I mean, this is sort of like decent leg structure, I guess, is like, again, decent version, harder to work with version. I do know, so like a few people had sort of robot designs that necessitated this because like there was a ball joint in the knee and like you need to put the joint in the ball joint, that kind of thing. If that is the case and that is a problem for how your rig is set up, what you can do is, and this is not like an ideal solution, but it is like a decent kind of workaround for having the knee bend really, really crazy. So what you can do is go ahead, I'm just going to make this little controller here and set up a pole vector constraint. So grab your controller and grab IK handle 2, constrain, and pole vector. And you'll notice that this is actually like, as soon as I did that, it's going to change the direction that this leg is pointing in. If you're lucky, this isn't going to like destroy your how your robot model works in terms of like, you know, popping joints out of where they should be. But you'll notice like I can bend this, and instead of bending like, it does break down a little bit when you get like crazy, sort of bend the foot up really, really high. But it does do a better job at sort of controlling where your leg should be bending, in case that was like an issue that anyone was facing. Again, I know people sort of set up their rigs like this. My usual recommendation is just like chuck a pole vector in there. It'll do a good job of sort of controlling it a little bit, so you don't need to just like manually adjust twist forever. But yeah. So does that help anyone? Does anyone have any other questions about IK handles? Okay. Yeah.
So when you put the IP handles in, it stops like rotation.
Oh, like you can't control the like foot rotation?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Yes, so there is also a relatively not terrible fix for that. I'm going to make a very depressing looking foot for a very depressing looking Pinocchio. All right, I'm gonna call that a foot. And I'm just gonna go ahead and bind this skin to this little joint here. So basically what we have, like if we move IK handle 1, there's, like I try to rotate this, there's no way to control that foot. Is that what you're talking about?
Like the arm is already made,
Hmm?
and like wherever the IP handle is, nothing will rotate.
Okay. I might just take a look at your rig. Are you talking about like the IK handles or I'm sorry, what do you, I'm sorry, you're just saying the FK controllers no longer work. Okay. That should be that should be working, if I'm understanding what you're saying. So the IK and FK setups for joints are designed to separate from each other. So like your FK controls should not be following your IK controls and vice versa. And they're designed to behave in different ways. So theoretically, like once you've hooked up an IK handle to your joints, your FK joints should no longer affect them. What you'd want to do in that case is set up like the switch attribute. So basically you'd be toggling your joints back and forth between like, hey, I'm going to pay attention to this IK handle, or hey, I'm going to pay attention to the FK controls that exist there. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. I can take more a look at that when I run around. But yeah. All right. Any other questions with IK handles? Okay. Really quick, since I just have this here, if you do, you will notice like if I move this, I want to control the foot and maybe have this stay flat instead of just sort of randomly going off in a direction that I have no control at all over. To do that, you just grab the, I should make a control for this. That's what I should do. So you just want to make a control for this joint and point constrain it to your IK handle, and then grab your controller, grab the whatever your ankle or your wrist joint, and do an orient constraint on that. So that way, if you move this controller, you can see the foot is staying level instead of flopping around, and I'm now able to actually have manual control over the rotation of that foot. But yeah, that's pretty much like my weird bit on Pinocchio IK handles. Anyone, while I have the IK stuff up, anyone have any other questions about that? Cool. All right, back to my survey. IK handles. Anyone interested in seeing me like live set up a basic switch?
Yes, please.
I like the emphatic responses. All right, let me put this back where I found it. Okay, I'm gonna just murder this entire leg here because it's dead to me. And while I'm doing this, do you guys care about foot controls? Like seeing me like live set up like all the IK foot stuff? Okay. My other class was like very into that. But anywho, that being said, if you are curious about that, see the video from earlier today with my other class, because I did go through that whole thing live. All right, so I'm just going to really quickly hide my geometry. Where am I going? Polygons. And I'm just going to dump a bunch of controllers onto the joints directly. Always remember as you're doing this to actually zero out your controllers. Delightful practice. And I will make a random floating switch control just over here because I can. All right, grab all new controllers. Always freeze the transformations. You'll cry if you don't, and you'll have to like unconstrain your stuff and reconstrain it, and always zero your controllers. All right, so these are going to be my FK controls. I should probably label these, but I'm not going to. And I'm just going to go ahead and just do an orient constraint. Oh, hello. With maintain offset turned on, please. Thank you kindly. Ooh, look at all of these delightful rotations it's added. That's bad. I'm going to undo that. I'm just going to, for grins, delete this IK handle and just make sure that that does seem to maybe have added some random rotations to things. In case anyone was curious or like didn't know this, you can click on a constraint in your outliner, and if you look in your channel box, you can see what's attached to it. So in this case, it's being attached to NURB Circle 2. So I delete that. And then, why do all my joints have rotations? I'm just going to click on all of my joints, zero out the rotations. Don't know why they were there. And then go ahead and try to reconstrain this. And now we have lovely joints without rotations, which is always fun. All right, so that is FK leg. If we move this upper bit, it should theoretically move the lower bit. Anyone know why it's not? Yes. Yeah. Kind of. I haven't parented them together in the outliner. So I don't even remember. I'm actually gonna label like 2 of these. And so I need like the ankle to be a child of the knee, and the knee to be a child of the upper leg. So if I grab this one, it should then rotate. Hello. It should rotate the rest of them, but clearly I've done something wrong. What have I done wrong? That's what? Oh, yes, good. That's the opposite of what I want. Okay. I've attached them together very, very wrong. What have I done here? Okay. So this guy should go under this, and then this should go under. Yes. Delightful. We have a functional leg. All right, so that's the FK setup. That should be good to go. IK setup, and I'm assuming you guys are talking about basic switch, yeah, not the 3-limb thing. Cool. So skeleton, I'm just going to make an IK handle. Drop that in there. And I'm going to go ahead and attach the handle to the IK control I made with just a crappy little point constraint. I actually should make sure that my point constraint did not before is maintain offset turned on. Great. Are you doing the things? Cool. How is that? Whatever. That should be centered on the joint. I don't care enough to fix it right now. If it's actually a rig, you should totally fix that. So what we have right now is this should be, I'd be able to move this. Usually at this point, it does some weird snapping. Like if I move interesting. If I move the FK joints, sometimes it'll like snap your joint back or your limbs back onto this. Generally, if that has been a problem for you, that's fixed once you finish setting up your IK. But basically what we want to do is we have the IK handle, we have the FK controls, we need a way to toggle between them. To do that, we're going to use this little switch control and do edit add attribute. Feel free to stop me for questions. I'm just sort of like assuming that like this is supposed to be mostly like a refresher, or that you'll stop me if you were having issues with a particular area. So feel free, again, to actually stop me if you do have questions. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this switch. And this you would like to be a integer of minimum 0 and maximum of 1. Yeah.
With the switch,
Yes.
where in the outline does that fall?
In the where?
In the outline, like with the master, the FK, and the IK handles, where does the switch go?
Ah, yes. I'll get to that later. Usually I actually sort of throw it off in its own little group, and then I actually parent constrain that group so that it follows the ankle or the wrist. But I will go over that in like a few minutes. All right, so again, switch, integer of 0 and 1. I did actually notice the other day, someone didn't cap their values at 1, and it did actually break things once you exceeded 1, which I thought was interesting. So what you want to do is just go in and sort of hook up a bunch of these constraints to each other. And there's like really only one thing you need to hook up, and that is if you're looking at the IK handle, this little IK blend value here. You'll notice if we set that to 0, the IK control no longer moves the handle, and this leg is operating purely as FK, even though it still does obviously have that IK handle on it. So that's, again, what we're going to hook up. We're going to go to Windows, General Editors, and Connection Editor. Pull this thing up. So the left side is going to be the IK control, and the right side is going to be the IK handle. In case there's ever any doubt, this operation is basically copy a value from thing A and paste into thing B. So think of take a value from thing A and put it into thing B. And just in case there's ever, again, any confusion of like which side you should be putting things in, it does kind of tell you up here. So you should be good to scroll down. Whoops. Sorry, I should be adding this to my switch, not my IK control. So I'm going to reload the left. So we should be click on the switch control. It's going to show you basically all of the stuff that it can be attached to. Anything it can't be, it'll gray out. And you just want to find the IK blend attribute, which is right here. Click it, and it should be hooked up. So what should happen if I'll move my IK control somewhere, and I will, right now this is at 0, so it should be operating again as like FK. There we go. If I switch this to 1, it's not doing anything, which is highly questionable. Well, that's disappointing. What did I do? What did I do? That should be working. Hang on. Dump all that back where it was. If anybody notices something stupid I did, please tell me.
Is that the IK control? Or is that just,
It should be on this switch, like this little attribute for switch I made, which shows up here. And if it's weird because if you click on the IK handle, this is attached, like this little yellow thing is like, it's attached to something. If I unclick this, it unattaches it. Just for grins, what happens if what? Really? That's super weird. What? Okay. Well, I have literally never seen this not work before, but in the event that it doesn't work for some strange reason and you can't figure out why, there's an alternate way that you can set this up, which hopefully also doesn't randomly break. Also, weird tidbit, if you guys are ever looking to delete a constraint or like unhook up an attribute and you don't remember what you constrained it to or like what you were trying to find, right-click on the attribute and just do break connections. If you do this, like it'll get rid of any constraint that was on this or on that particular attribute, unhook it up from anything like in the connection editor. You'll notice like when I reload this, this is now ungrayed out. I'd love to know why that's not working. Anywho, so kind of worst case scenario for this is setting up a set-driven key. If you go into your animation menu, key, where is it? Set-driven key. For some reason you have to open up the settings for this, otherwise the window doesn't pop up. Here's the window. So you want your control, this like little switch value in your control to be the driver, and the IK handle to be the driven. And what you want to do is just grab the switch attribute and the IK blend attribute. Make sure that if your switch is set to 0, it should be operating as FK. So make sure that your IK blend and your switch are both set to, again, like 0 for the switch and blend for also for 0. Go ahead and key that. Go back to your switch, set the switch attribute to 1, and your IK handle, IK blend, it should also be 1. And go ahead and key this again. Hopefully, this will have actually worked. Oh my god, we have FK functionality. By FK, I mean IK. Great. No. Why? This, ladies and gentlemen, is a very, very weird demo. Okay. I've actually never seen it not hook this up before. I have a bad theory, and that is maybe like Maya has just gone insane. Sometimes it happens. I'm going to see what happens if I close Maya and reopen it. That shouldn't fix anything, but sometimes it does. Oops. Ah, no. No. I'm opening up a second window of Maya, and it was not intentional. All right. If this works, I'm going to be a little salty. Set a keyframe on that like a nut job. Really? Okay. I know what I did, maybe. This shouldn't affect this, but I remembered I made this attribute a float. Or I made it an integer instead of a float. Sorry guys, give me 10 seconds. If this doesn't work, I'll just sort of walk you through on a functional rig how to set up the other attributes. So in this case, what I'm going to do is just go ahead and grab my switch and do delete attributes. Make a new attribute that is, I can't type at all today, float with a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 1, not an integer. Add that in. Again, this shouldn't fix anything, but maybe this is just a weird quirk of Maya. I'm just going to go into my connection editor again, switch control on the left with my completely terribly named attribute, and we're going to hook this up to our IK blend, which was apparently already hooked up to something else. Oh. So hopefully, yes, okay. I have absolutely no idea why this wasn't working. Normally I would just make a new joint chain, but barring that, that's very frustrating. Anywho. So there was questions about how to make this follow the joints. And that's basically just sort of, you can do one of two things. If it's a single object, you can just constrain the object directly. If it's like a group of finger controls, I usually throw them in a group. Just call it like finger controls. And you just want to grab this little wrist or ankle joint, and then your controller or group of controllers, and you just want to go in and do a parent constraint to that. Go ahead and apply that, and then whenever you move your... Really? This Maya scene is like so broken right now. It should be that whenever you move these controllers, it will also take this with the ankle. But now my blend... What? What? Oh, this is so fantastically broken. Okay. that is how you should usually attach things. I think I'm gonna give up on this file. Does anybody want to see me do this? I'll grab my rig and I can like reset up the later part of this on something not disgusting and broken. Or, yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry, that was like a super weird demo. All right, so I'm just gonna grab my rig file that I just have on the Google Drive. I will download this and deposit it into a new Myosine. Huzzah. All right. Hopefully this works better. Maya, I have no faith in you at all. All right, so we've been doing, I'm gonna do an arm because I think it's a little bit of sort of nicer control. Also, if you guys ever want to, you can hook up your fingers so you can just bend all of the joints of your finger at once. It's kind of convenient. Anywho, I'm just gonna duplicate this controller and delete this switch controller. So theoretically, nothing should work if I do anything in the switch value because it's not the one I hooked up, it's just a random duplicate. All right, so we should have, theoretically, joints with, somewhere in here, I have IK handles. Hooray. All right, so setting up the switch, hopefully this works this time. Haha. Again, Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor. Grab your switch control and the IK handle for whatever limb you're modifying. And it should be switch into IK blend. And hopefully, if we do this, oh look, I've broken a thumb controller. We should be able to toggle between FK and, yes, FK and IK. And something's gone very, very wrong with the orient constraints on this wrist. But you can see that it is actually moving between the two. So at a value of 1, it's going to behave like an IK arm. And at a value of 0, it's going to be an FK arm. So that should be setting up the basic actual switch of the arm itself. You will notice, any questions on that? Cool. You will notice that the wrist is doing something insane and exploded, and I honestly don't even know what the heck that's doing. That is because I have some attributes that need to be set up, reset up sort of better after I deleted the constraint. Whenever you're doing modifications to the rig, you should always zero out your rig. Rigs are just sort of weird about that. So make sure that like this is in bind pose, all your skeletons are straight in the same spot that they were originally, and then you should be good. So what I'm going to do next is when the rig is in IK mode, I want this IK control to control the wrist. When it's in FK mode, I want this FK control to control the wrist. Worst case scenario, your rig will function if you use the FK control to drive that hand rotation when in IK mode. It's just really, really awkward because you're moving the IK handle everywhere and then you're like looking for your FK controller and you're like, where is this? It's just like floating in my scene. It's not a good, clean way to work. So what I'm going to do is just go through. I'm just going to make sure that I actually don't have anything. Yeah, so I have like this little constraint here. I'll get rid of that and show you guys how to set it up from scratch. But what you want to do is grab both of your controllers for your wrist, so your IK and your FK, then grab the wrist control itself and set up, all you need is an orient constraint that was broken on my computer when I first set this up, which is why I had parent. So just make sure that maintain offset's turned on. Should be good to apply that. And just double check it's not added weird rotations to your joints. So if you go through and close all of this extra finger crap, you'll have the constraint right here. And you can see, if you, again, look in your channel box, it tells you what it's constrained to. So we have the FK wrist and the IK wrist. So if I move the IK, it's going to move that wrist. And if I move the FK, it's also going to move that wrist. It's better to not leave both affecting the thing at the same time. It's just like very, very confusing to work with. So what we want to do is set up a set-driven key to control basically when it's in FK mode, only the FK wrist is going to mess with the rotation of that joint. When it's in IK mode, only IK is going to affect it. And you can do that by changing the influence or the weights on these joints. So again, we have the wrist, the FK wrist here. If we set this to 0, oh, delightful. That's fun. Okay. This is actually why I started using parent constraints, because whenever I messed with these, it would flip my wrist crazy. So if you need to set up a parent constraint like an orient constraint, constrain, parent, turn off translate, this will behave just like an orient constraint. And hopefully, if you go back and you click on this, when I zero this out, it doesn't flip the wrist crazy directions. That's what you want. If it flips the wrist, that's bad. So in this case, again, we've set IK to 0 and FK to 1. So if we move the IK wrist, nothing happens. If we move the FK wrist, the hand is going to rotate. So we just want to sort of hook this up with our switch. So when our switch is set to 0, we want FK controlling the wrist entirely, which is actually what we have now. So we're going to go back up to our animation menu, key, set driven key, set. And then the switch is going to be the driver, and the parent constraint on the wrist is going to be the driven. And in this case, we want IK-FK switch is the one that we care about modifying, and we want that to modify these two little weights here. Anything with like a W0, W1 is just like weight 1, weight 2. That's how you sort of know what you're looking for, but basically we're just going to hook up all these values together. Going to set a keyframe, set our switch to 1, and then go into our parent constraint and basically swap the values. So what was 1 is now 0, what was 0 is now 1. Key that, and theoretically, so this is an IK mode right now. You can IK mode, and the IK handle is, or the control is controlling the wrist. If I do FK, nothing happens. That's what we want. So what we should be able to do is then take this and switch it back to FK mode. IK handle does nothing. FK controls the wrist. Does it make sense? Hopefully? Okay. So basically set-driven keys are just sort of, it's like a keyframe sort of down here, except instead of toggling through a set number of frames, it's just sort of remotely activated on value changes. So in this case, as you swap through the switch, it's going to change the values of the constraints. So if I set this to something like 0.7, and we look at our constraint in here, you'll notice that instead of being values of 0 and 1, Maya is automatically interpolating between those and just sort of blending. So in this case, like the IK has more weight than the FK wrist. So set-driven keys are really handy for stuff like that. That you don't want to control remotely. You can, control multiple attributes with a single custom-made attribute, basically. So that is the sort of basic switch on a actual functional arm. And you'll notice, like, as I move the wrist, a few things are happening. So thing one is that the oh, right. Okay. I was like, why is my handle not following my control? And I was like, yes, the switch is set to 0.7. If I set it to 1, it'll attach to the control. So a few things are happening. One is that the IK arm is separating from the FK joints. That's totally fine, normal, and what you actually want. My finger control is doing, I have no idea what. It's separating aggressively. And this switch control, I would like to follow the hand, again, so I don't need to hunt for it in my scene. So I'll show you how to set all that stuff up. I'll at least show you the hand. I have no idea what I've done to that finger control. Something very, very not good. So for this switch control, again, just grab your wrist joint, grab the control itself, and just do a parent constraint. It should pretty much drag it along. What have I done? Did I not do the thing? Oh, whoops. So I did a parent constraint, but it was only for, I had turned off the translation, so it only constrained rotate. So I'm going to go ahead and just sort of click that back on, grab my wrist, grab the switch, and then apply that again. Hopefully this time it'll actually, yeah. So now the controller follows along, and you'll notice again that if I toggle back and forth between the two, that switch controller is always going to follow the wrist. It just makes for easier animating. It's especially courteous if you're setting up a rig for someone else to animate that you do this so they don't need to hunt for random floating controllers everywhere. So that's attaching that. Any questions on that? Cool. In this case, I have no idea why this is floating around really crazily. It seems normally if I'm looking for something like this, it's like there's an extra group or something somewhere that has just gotten like really messed up. In this case, I'm going to hazard a guess that if I go ahead and take this control and parent it directly under the first one, that maybe that would fix the issue. Doesn't. Yeah. Oh, wait, did I? No, I don't know. That's super weird. I actually don't know why it's doing that. That would probably be a thing. Does anybody want to sit here and watch me try to figure out why that's not working? I thought it might be like an easy fix. It seems generally unappealing, so I'm gonna, unless someone says otherwise, I'm going to ignore that for now. But for the fingers, again, this is just, all the fingers are just in a group together, and then I've deleted the parent constraint so they don't follow the hand right now. Again, you can totally animate it like this. It's just very, very annoying to have to find your fingers in the scene, which is why, again, just grab the wrist and then grab the, in this case, the group with all the fingers and do another parent constraint, and that'll just sort of go along for the ride. But yeah, that's a basic FK IK switch. Anybody have any questions on that? Anything they want to see additionally? Cool. I think that was most of the stuff. So someone said do a live fancy switch. Anyone interest? Cool. IK foot controls. I think you guys have already said eh. All right. And then these are, I don't know what most of these are. So that was my bit on rigging. Anybody have any other questions about rigging before we break into open lab and individual troubleshooting? All right then. If that's the case, give me 5 seconds to throw this class recording.